Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's event. How can you prevent, detect, and respond to advanced threats? Before we get started, I'd like to explain some of the ways that you can participate. This presentation is being recorded and you're currently in listen-only mode. We encourage you to participate in the session today by using the message panel at any time to ask questions or provide comments. Simply type in the white box and click send. If you experience any technical difficulties, please refresh your browser by clicking the refresh button or by pressing F5 on your keyboard. If this does not resolve your issue, please send us a message and we will work to get your problem resolved. I would now like to hand things over to your presenter, Chris Poland. Chris, you now have the floor.
Thank you so much, and welcome everybody. Thanks for coming, and I also want to thank Lighthouse Computer Services for putting this all together and inviting us here. So my name is Chris Poland. I am a research strategist for IBM's X-Force, so we do threat intelligence research. And I'll tell you a little bit about that here in a second. So effectively, what the X-Force does is we find out what kind of threat actors, what kind of trends are out there, what kind of phishing schemes, what kind of malware. We research into the threat actors themselves and lurk on their underweb boards and try to figure out in advance what they're doing, or at least understand the threats that are coming your way. And we feed that all into our products. So as you can see in this graphic here, we underpin most of the IBM portfolio, or all of the IBM security portfolio. And the whole thing is overlaid with security intelligence and analytics, which is always important. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. And just to give you a little bit more color, and I already sort of mentioned this, we go through and we do things like we analyze malware. So for example, if you've been keeping track of recent events, you'll know that there's an organization called, oh my God, I just blanked on their name. They actually provide malware, or they provide tools, security tools to governments, effectively. The hacking team, there we go. I knew it would come to me eventually. And they were just pastebin, so a lot of their stuff was put on pastebin, so they were compromised. And so what we'll do is we'll go look at pastebin and things like that, and we'll take the malware, we'll try to figure out what kind of malware is out there, what kind of vulnerabilities they're exploiting, so look for 0 days and things like that, and let our customers know about that stuff. We also have an IP reputation database, so we will go out, we have a web crawler that basically looks at a bunch of IP websites, categorizes them, and also gives them a reputation. So is this thing known to contain a bunch of malware? Is it fine? Et cetera, et cetera. We also have spam traps. And now, I always thought when I first came here that spam was kind of boring and it was passé. But the interesting thing is more than 80% of malware is delivered to customers through phishing schemes, which effectively is spam, right? It's a form of spam in some way. So we actually capture email and we look at the kind of malware that's attached to it and the kind of schemes they use and whether they're using obfuscated links and how they're using it, et cetera, et cetera. So we're basically trying to figure out what the tactics, techniques, and procedures are of the bad guys before it actually gets used, so we can help you out. So we do all of that stuff, and I call that sort of the latent research. So if you look on the right-hand side here, we say we have depth. We actually analyze 25 billion web pages and images. We look at 12 million plus spam and phishing attacks daily. We categorize vulnerabilities. I don't know if I mentioned that, but we actually have a vulnerability database that we've been keeping track of since 1996, I think. So quite a long time. So we do all that, and that's sort of blatant. So that's stuff that may attack you, but isn't necessarily attacking you or customers. We also have our managed services who basically watch our customers, and they look for attacks that are actually happening to customers. So on one hand, we've got the latent side. On the other hand, we actually can see what's happening. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But here, it gives you some idea of the breadth of our managed services offerings. So let's jump into the content. Now that you know a little bit about the X-Force and what we do, one of the things that we do is that we go out and poll customers and find out what they're concerned about. We also look at the trends out there. So I'm going to present to you some trends that we've seen. But first, let me start by pointing out that given 2014 and the number of attacks that we've seen, and the number of successful compromises, I'm not going to implicate anybody, but I'll show you some anonymized statistics here in a second. It's no surprise that when we talk to the security leaders, what their second biggest worry is about external threats. So how did all these big organizations get compromised, and are they going to be next? And they also worry about the mechanism, by the way, number one, of getting compromised. So they worry about things that are innovative technology that they don't quite understand what the threat profile is. So things like cloud and mobile and the Internet of Things. So that's sort of the transforming landscape, you know. So everybody's used to their IT servers, and we understand malware, we understand antivirus, and all that kind of stuff. But what do we have to worry about when it comes to all these new technologies? So number two, though, is the amount of attacks. And so one of the things that we do is we track all of these attacks on a yearly basis. And this particular chart goes back to 2012, although we have a chart that goes back to 2009. But the point here is that you can see, and we back in 2011, I think, the X-Force said that was the year of the breach. And we thought it wasn't going to get any bigger than that. And as you can see, it has gotten a lot bigger. The attacks and the compromises have continued to grow. We've seen a 40% increase since 2012. In 2013, we saw 800,000 records were leaked. And then this year, we've seen about 1 billion records leaked. So it's actually increased since then. So one of the things to notice about this chart, by the way, is that the size of the bubble, the circle on there, is the estimated impact on the organization, whether it's financial, you know, so we actually know that they've lost money and sometimes it's publicized, or in the case of distributed denial of service, we sort of estimate the amount of impact that it has on the organization because it's not easy to tie that to money. Nevertheless, it's estimated is the point that I'm making, but the color of the circle is how the organization was breached. And so one of the things that concerns me the most is that a lot of these circles are gray, which means that it was not disclosed. And the reason, there's only two real reasons why you would not disclose that you were, or how you were breached. Number one is that you were trying to hide that for some reason. But the reality is that we know that organizations that disclose how they were breached manage to retain their customer loyalty better because they actually can say, look, yes, we got breached. We had to announce it because of US-based breach laws. But here's how it happened, and so trust us. We have closed this off. We invested more money to make sure this doesn't happen again, mea culpa, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one reason. The other reason, which I think is more likely, is that the organizations did not have the capability to actually determine how they were breached in the first place. So they were not prepared for incident response. They didn't have the appropriate forensics data, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a second here. So when we start looking at the overall compromised records, what we see is that in 2014, we saw that there were 1 billion records that were compromised. Now, there was a release from a company called Hold Security that said they had found 1.2 billion account records online in effectively an underground form. So what we think, though, is that a lot of that stuff was just accumulated over time. It was basically just a trove of hacked accounts that was just an accumulation. Going back many years, there was a lot of redundancy, and there were a lot of accounts that were no longer active, or the password had been changed, or whatever it is. So we actually took all of that data out. We omitted the 1.2 billion records from the whole security incident. And what you see here with 1 billion is actually verified unique incidents that occurred in 2014 as reported by the organizations who were breached. So it's pretty scary. We would like to see us go down in terms of breached records, but so far the trend has not managed to validate that. Although I will say between 2012, 2013, and 2014, we are sort of trending for less and less, but then again, 1 year does not a trend make. So it could be that 2015 could be 5 billion, who knows? You know, our hope obviously is that it starts to go down and it approaches zero again, and we have a little bell curve, but we'll see. So let's talk about a few of them, actually. So one of them happened in 2014, and you can see, and by the way, this particular slide is a screen capture from something we call the X-Force Interactive Security Incidents, XFISI. You can actually go onto the IBM site and just type in IBM space XFISI in Google, and you'll pop up on this. I thought I put the link in here, but apparently not. So in any case, this is it's a way that you can interactively go ahead and look at incidents by industry, by size, by type of attack, et cetera, et cetera. So in this particular case, I basically went to look at some, I was looking for a particular one, a media and entertainment breach that happened in late 2014. Anybody can guess who they are. And what we find here is that they were attacked through malware and distributed denial of service. So kind of an interesting trend that we've seen is that DDoS is being used not just to attack companies to take them offline. A lot of times what we've seen is DDoS is being used to divert attention from the security teams so that they'll go try to remediate the DDoS, and at the same time, the attackers are stealing. So on one hand, right, it's like a pickpocket. They'll get somebody to distract you, and while they're picking your pocket on the other side. Actually, I like to tell people, this is how I kind of think of this. That was sort of the pickpocket thing is a little bit tame in my view. I grew up in Africa part of my life, and I remember when I was about 10 years old, I was walking in some snake grass once, and there was a native kid who must have been 5 or 6, and he came up and he put his hand out, stop, stop, stop. So I stopped, and I looked down, and there was a black mamba, which is one of the most poisonous snakes. So this kid, little young kid, he basically walked up to it, and he started waving his hand, and the snake got mesmerized, and the kid started making it a little bit more movement with it. And all of a sudden, the snake struck at his hand, and as it did, the kid whipped his right hand around and grabbed it behind the neck and beat it up against a rock. So that's kind of how I think of it, right? The left hand is the DDoS, and the right hand is when they actually go and beat your corporate pocket against a rock and steal all your coin. So that's one of the attacks that we've seen. We've also seen some retail breaches, and if we look at this one, it is also in late 2014, about mid to late 2014. Again, I think you can guess who that is. They actually got in through SQL injection and by installing malware and phishing. A lot of times, by the way, malware and phishing go hand in hand because the malware is actually delivered through phishing schemes. But as you can see in this particular case, SQL injection, there was multiple vectors that ended up attacking this particular home improvement chain. And they ended up with a fair amount of loss as well. Going to 2015, we actually saw a healthcare breach, and that was through, again, malware and phishing, but also some physical security. And by that, by the way, physical security is not just about a black bag job. Don't think Mission Impossible hanging from a string, trying not to sled onto the pressure-sensitive floor. More to the point, though, physical also includes things like theft of USB drives, theft of storage media, or loss of them. A lot of times we see, particularly in healthcare, we see that media, like a laptop, was left in a car, and then the car was broken into, and the laptop was stolen. So that's what physical means in this particular case. But as you can see, we see so far it's been media, entertainment, retail, and healthcare. So we're seeing data being stolen from lots of different organizations. It's not just targeting one, although those tend to be the top 3. So now if we take a look at all of 2014, you can see that there's a fairly representative, most industries are fairly representative, although computer services ranks at the top. So if you look in that little middle graph there with the bars. So what computer services means is DNS providers, telecommunication providers, just anybody, cloud providers, so anybody who's got data that's out in the real world. So DNS providers, by the way, are really interesting because you can actually, if you break into a DNS provider, now you can redirect the consumer, your target, to your own site and then steal their credentials or perform a man-in-the-middle attack. So, and then, of course, cloud, if you break into that, then all bets are off, right? That's where cloud data is, assuming it's unencrypted. So it turns out that computer services is a fairly ripe target for bad guys for obvious reasons. Followed by consumer products, education. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not true. That's the next one is telecommunications, which is not part of computer services. My apologies to everyone out there. Computer services are cloud and DNS and things like that. And then there is government has been attacked has been attacked quite a bit. Although this particular data, 2014, does not include the recent government attacks as of 2 or 3 weeks ago. By the way, for those of you who haven't been paying attention to that particular attack, it was about 4 million records reported initially, and now it's up to about 21.5 million records we think that were stolen, but also about 1.1 million fingerprints, because a lot of the records that were stolen were for people who were applying for security clearances. So think about that next time you use a biometric reader as a form of authentication. And incidentally, when we talk about authentication, and there are arguments in the security community, but just I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up, that fingerprints or any biometric is not technically an authentication mechanism. It's actually an identification mechanism, and it requires some form of authentication to prove it out. So it is kind of interesting that people talk about biometrics as actually an authentication mechanism, where in fact it's not strong enough for most for most applications in that sense. So just FYI. And then just for the sake of argument, and I did a screen cap about 2 weeks ago, so before the big government organization was breached, and as you can tell, it's not the one that has tax filings, because that is present in this chart. We can see that computer services is still #1 in 2015, and then followed by media and entertainment, because that got skewed a little bit, and telecommunications. So again, it's kind of interesting. I urge you to go to the XFISI site and just sort of poke around and, see what your industry looks like. See what kind of attacks are most prevalent in your industry, and make sure that you've got coverage for that kind of stuff. So what we do see, though, is that a lot of the breaches are not about technology. They're about the fundamentals that the target organizations are applying. So when we go back and we look at one of the retail breaches back in 2014, the major one, the one that started everybody talking, if you all know what I'm talking about, it turns out that they actually had a piece of technology that alerted them in June or July, that they might have malware. That was 6 months in advance of the time when they actually detected that they had been breached. So they, in effect, they had an early warning, but they chose to ignore the warning. Most likely because they did not have enough manpower actually watching, either implementing the technology or operationalizing it. Somebody sitting there who had the capability to investigate these kind of alerts, the experience, the time to do it, maybe not an escalation process to deal with it. So they basically didn't know what to do. You've got a busy security administrator. They go to this new piece of technology and says, hey, you might have some malware. And they're like, I don't really know how to investigate this. I'll spend 10 minutes doing it. And then I'll just say, hey, that's white noise, and move on with my day. That's how things tend to work a lot of times. In fact, our general manager here in the security systems, he talks about a customer that he visited who has over 45 products from more than 80 vendors. So security technology products in their organization to help stop these threats. But the reality is that most organizations will spend money on the products, but not on the manpower to actually to get them up and running, tuned properly, and integrated with their processes. So something that that I get concerned about quite often, that we need to spend more money on people, get more eyeballs on screens, and get our existing technology working before we actually start investing in the newest, coolest technology. So, but some of the basic things that we're seeing are a lack of security fundamentals. We see a lot of password reuse. In fact, I think, I can't remember what the statistics are, but I'm doing a project right now with our Apex product, our endpoint protection product, which can detect when corporate credentials are reused on external sites. So keep your eyes open for that particular piece of research. We also see default passwords being left on admin systems. If any of you out there has ever done any SQL administration, Oracle server administration, back before version 10 point something, there used to be a demo database that you could install, and it had a default username of Scott, and the password was Tiger, all lowercase, which gave you complete administrative access to the entire system, which was kind of interesting. And so I actually, in a previous life, did a lot of pen testing and got into a lot of databases using Scott and Tiger. So just so as you know. We also see poor challenge questions for password reset procedures. So what's your mother's maiden name? You know how easy it is to find your mother's maiden name? All you got to do is go to obituaries, right? Because a lot of obits have personal information, including maiden names in them. Look for marriage announcements. Go onto Facebook, for Pete's sake. People put a lot of stuff out there. In fact, that's why I like the system that'll let you put in your own challenge question instead of having some predefined ones, because I like the one where here's the challenge question. What are you wearing right now? So now when I call up tech support, the person on the other end has to say, what are you wearing right now? And then my answer is, that's an inappropriate question. Can I speak to your manager? So try to guess that one. Oh, of course, now you know my challenge question, so I've got to go change it, but there you go. So we're also seeing what we're calling cracks in the foundation. So basically, where people are using particular pieces of software that have widespread vulnerabilities. And a lot of these, we saw about 50% of all content management systems like WordPress and Joomla actually have vulnerabilities in them, and they're widespread. Plus, they leave access to a website. And it's not just those; it's also the plugins that you can add to your content management system or any type of system that's open source in that sense, right? So think about that for a second. There's a lot of plugins, to do different things with WordPress. Some of them are written by 14-year-old kids who just learned how to write PHP. So do you really want to trust your corporate security to that kind of a plugin? That's really what it boils down to. We actually had a bunch of those vulnerabilities disclosed in 2014, both with CMS systems and with other big systems. And we'll talk about OpenSSL here in a second, as well as Shellshock. Excuse me. Plus, we're also seeing some interesting things where privacy is eroding, and the privacy can lead to other things, such as figuring out what your password is, right? So if you think that having some sort of, let's say your Pinterest account is not particularly sensitive, and you have a real simple password based upon your dog's name and the number 1, so Fluffy1, and somebody gets into your Pinterest account, they might be able to leverage that point of presence to now impersonate you and gain access to some of your other things. Maybe looking at photos, maybe looking at the things that you write, so they know that you go to Vienna a lot. So now your password might be Vienna or something like that. Or be able to leverage the fact that they own your Pinterest account and now use that as a way to reset your password on something else. So there's all kinds of interesting ways that people are using privacy as a way to compromise security in that sense as well. Twitter is a perfect example, as is Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. So we're starting to see a lot of the intelligence gathering based upon targets, trying to figure out who you are, so that you can send, for example, a successful phishing scheme. So you know that the CEO of the company is actually interested in golf. He goes to Costa Rica every week. Send him a phishing email saying, "Hey, we want to offer these free passes for 18 rounds of golf at this 5-star golf resort in Costa Rica." And he's more likely to click on that because obviously you know something about him. And so when we start looking at the attacks, I already talked about the fact that almost half, right, a little less than half, are undisclosed. When we start looking at the rest of them, we see that malware and phishing, so let's combine those two for about 21.8, so 22%, fall in number 2 category. Again, because malware and phishing kind of are combined together. Followed by DDoS, but remember, DDoS is now being used to mask an actual data theft attack. So, probably a third to a half of the DDoSes are actually combined with malware and phishing and SQL injection and whatever else. So it is kind of interesting when you sort of break all these things down. What we find is that brute force attacks don't comprise a lot of actual compromises. Misconfiguration, which means somebody misconfigured their system and let somebody in it, and watering hole don't comprise that big a slice. Heartbleed does not either. However, we think that a lot of people don't actually know that they were compromised through Heartbleed. They might have been compromised some way, but they don't know that it was from Heartbleed, right? Because otherwise you would have patched OpenSSL. So that probably would eat into that undisclosed part of the pie as well. So just sort of an interesting point of view. Also, just as another data point, in 2014 we saw that there were a certain amount of vulnerabilities that were disclosed. So we saw that the disclosures, about a third of the disclosures were from the top 10 enterprise vendors. So they're doing a lot of disclosures, probably because they're being targeted. You think like an attacker, I'm going to target software that's widely deployed. We also see about 15% are disclosures related to something called CERT. CERT put out a vulnerability called 582497. I'll talk about that in a second. And then the others are just in other categories. So over 57% were in other categories, not the top 10, not due to this specific vulnerability. Now, when it comes to the specific vulnerability we're talking about, it's kind of interesting because the way that MITRE assigns CVE IDs is usually based upon a specific vulnerability. Now, there was a researcher at CERT, at the Computer Emergency Response Team, as part of Carnegie Mellon University, who actually found a vulnerability in the way that Android apps, some Android apps, actually found in one Android app at first, obviously, that the way it handles SSL certificates, basically. I won't go too far deep into it. And so he said, well, I wonder how many other apps have this vulnerability. It seems like a common thing. So he wrote a script that went out and it pulled, I think, I'm going to say 1 million apps from the Android Play Store, Google Play Store, and he basically did an automated test of those to see if it was vulnerable to the same vulnerability. And he found that 24,000 were. And so what ended up happening was that this kind of broke the CVE vulnerability tracking system because do you track vulnerabilities based upon its general category, so an OpenSSL vulnerability, or do you track it based upon the apps that the vulnerability is found in? And so he basically had started to send a bunch of vulnerability reports to CERT, and it turned out to be 24,000 of them. And so it's kind of interesting. Do we count vulnerabilities by app or by general category? Because in this particular case, the vulnerability it was specific to the way the code was written. However, it was the same sort of error in the way that the OpenSSL was viewed. So in other words, it wasn't a single library that caused the problem, in which case it would be one CVE-ID. It was the use of the library and how the code was written around to integrate into the app that was the problem. But it was a pretty common way to create a problem. So kind of an interesting thing to look at. So when we talk about vulnerabilities that actually were quite large, that actually affected a single library that caused many applications to break, what we saw in 2014 were a few. We saw Heartbleed, which affected the way that OpenSSL dealt with Heartbleed requests. And I'll talk about that in a second in case you don't know. Then there was Shellshock, which exploited a vulnerability in the Unix bash shell, which is 25 years old, which is kind of interesting. And then Poodle, which exploited an SSL 3.0 protocol problem, as did Freak, which is not linked to this. So the point that we're making here is that we saw a disturbing trend in 2014, which is that security researchers are looking for press. So what's common around all of these is that the researchers put up a website, created a logo, created a big PR campaign around their findings, and then released all of this. I believe all of these actually went through a fair amount of responsible disclosure. So after they found the vulnerability, they notified all the vendors that they could to try to get them to patch it before they did the release. But the point is that there's almost this pride in finding vulnerabilities, which is a double-edged sword. Yes, we want those to be found, and we'd like them to be fixed in the software. But now we're starting to see that people want to get in the game and get notoriety for finding these bugs, these vulnerabilities, excuse me. So Heartbleed, just for those of you who may not be in the know technically, it's actually a pretty simple vulnerability. What ends up happening is that when you create a TLS or an encrypted session between, let's just say in this case, a laptop and a web server, but you could do it between any device, right? What ends up happening is that there is this thing called a heartbeat request. So within the TLS communication, you can actually say, hey, I just want to make sure that you're still alive. So it's sort of like a ping within SSL, if you will, or TLS. And so, so the sender who wants to do the ping, the heartbeat request, will send a string to it. Because if you know anything about ping, you can actually send a string in ping as well and say, send this back to me. So you send a string. Let's say the string is ABC. But the sender can also specify the length of the request. So how much data it expects back. So technically, you should, if you send ABC, you should say this is a string of 3 characters. So send me back ABC, it's a string of 3 characters. But instead, you can say, here's ABC, 3 characters, but this is a 30,000 byte request. So what ends up happening is that on the server side, it stores the string ABC. It says, hey, I got to send back 30,000 characters. So it starts reading where ABC is stored in memory, and it continues past that, which could be all kinds of random stuff. So for 30,000 bytes or 64,000 bytes. A lot of times that'll include unencrypted usernames and passwords. So let's say you're logging into an email system, and you type in your username and password, it goes across, and it gets stored in memory, at least temporarily, assuming that the web server doesn't just go overwrite the memory, which a lot of them don't. That stuff is just sitting around in memory. And so that gets sent back just as part of garbage, right? So to the requester. So now I can start basically just dumping contents of memory across the network by using this heartbeat request. And in fact, you can also, and it was proven by some researchers, you can actually get the private key for the SSL certificate and then completely compromise that server's encryption and authentication. So who cares, right? So one of the reasons that it was interesting is that we actually saw that the attackers are changing their tactics. They are coming to the party really quickly now. They're actually operationalizing exploits around these vulnerabilities far quicker than they ever have in the past. So it used to be, there would probably be a latency of about 2 to 3 months between the time a major vulnerability was announced and the bad guys had weaponized it. But what we saw with Heartbleed is that it was announced on 7 April, and on 8 April, we already saw, and I think on 7 April, we saw on GitHub, we saw a researcher had put out a proof of concept code so that you could actually compile it and lob it against your web server and see if it was vulnerable. It didn't exploit anything in particular. It just told you whether or not it was vulnerable to the Heartbleed to the vulnerability. And so the next day we saw that there were exploits in the wild, and in fact the Canadian Revenue Agency had to remove public access because it had been compromised as a result of Heartbleed. So 7 April, and then by 8 April and 9 April, we started seeing sites being compromised. In fact, when we look at the data from our managed services report, so remember 7 April, which is a little bit 3 days before this chart starts, was when Heartbleed was announced, and by 11 April, 4 days later, we started seeing a huge uptick. A week later, 14 and 15 April, we saw over 300,000 requests in 24 hours. Heartbleed vulnerabilities. What am I trying to say? Exploitation against the Heartbleed vulnerability. Then it tapered off a little bit later. So what we infer from this is the bad guys are weaponizing quickly, and they will lob it as long as it's useful to them, and then as soon as they find that everybody's past the vulnerability, they just move on. They're not going to actively exploit anymore because all it really does is expose them, because they're the source of some potentially malicious data. So they just move on to the next vulnerability. So they're becoming operationally sophisticated is what we're saying. Not as much technologically sophisticated as operationally sophisticated. And we see the same thing with the Shellshock bug. It was announced on 24 September. We raised our alert in the X-Force the next day, and then we started seeing 3 days later, through our managed services, we saw a 1,000% increase in the exploitation, or at least the triggering of an IPS signature that we have in our product that we use to manage customers, called command shell injection. So that means that we started seeing 1,000% increase just within 3 days of the release of Shellshock. So the other thing that our customers are saying is that over 60%, or about 60%, believe that the sophistication of the attackers is actually outstripping that of their organizational defenses. And so here's a few things that we're seeing. We're seeing something we're calling massively distributed APT malware. I actually don't like the term APT anymore as a result of this. I actually think that we should call this, and I'll tell you, actually, I'll hold on. I won't give you a spoiler quite yet. So what we mean by massively distributed is that we're seeing that it's off-the-shelf malware. It's not something that's completely custom. They're sending it to as far and wide as they can, and we see that there's already lots of machines infected. I'll show you a chart about that in a second. We're also seeing that this malware is written at a level of sophistication that lets even the most idiotic attacker use it. They've got great dashboards. They've got fantastic graphs to show you how the compromises are working. They've got idiot screens. And for those of you who haven't been paying attention to the way that they operationalize a lot of these malware campaigns, the bad guys, the crimeware, network has basically organized itself into 3 tiers. At the top of the pyramid, think of it as a pyramid. I wish I had a slide on this, but think of a pyramid. At the top, there's like the guys who write all this code. They write the new malware. Then there's this middleware tier. They're the guys who take the code and they go put up websites, and then and these websites are commerce websites for criminals. You could basically go onto there, and for 2 Bitcoin, you can say, I want to compromise 1,000 machines. And you can specify things like, I want them to be Windows machines, and I want them to be on the eastern seaboard of the United States. You can specify geography, you can specify operating system, you can specify language, you can specify all kinds of things. You've just ponied up, and so now you pony up your Bitcoin. So now those are the users. And in fact, you don't even have to be a smart user. You can be so dumb, which is why they're building in all this enhanced capability to use the software. They also have tech support. So if you're a bad guy and you just pony up your 2 Bitcoin and you can't read the dashboard because you're just not smart enough, you can actually call up the crimeware syndicate who's operationalizing stuff and say, hey, can you help me out with this? And they will give you support. So kind of weird. They also have made it dynamic enough to be repurposed. So if if there's exploiting Shellshock one day, then they can exploit the freak vulnerability tomorrow. So they make these things more dynamic, polymorphic, well, not polymorphic exactly, but you get the point there. And then finally, they make it highly evasive. So instead of APT, I kind of think of this as sort of common, massive threat, right? So it's not really advanced, it's kind of common. And then it's not really necessarily persistent as it is easy to use, right? So kind of an interesting thing. One of those that actually evolved from being more of a general or from a specific purpose piece of malware was something called Zeus. Zeus is a banking Trojan. It installs on a machine and it does a few things. But its basic functionality was to steal the username and password for end users who are going to their banking site. So that's really all it wanted to do. So it turned out there was this group of people who were developing it and they were launching it and reaping the benefits. But then they had a little fraction in their group. And so one of them said, I want to make it more general purpose. They were like, no, we just want to go against banking sites. So this guy took off and he created something called Citadel, which we think of as a Zeus variant, but it was sort of a separate development effort. However, we know that it's pretty much from the Zeus project because it is Zeus compatible. It actually uses config files from Zeus. The difference between Citadel, though, and Zeus is that Citadel also did things like key logging. It had the ability that you could upload plugins to do other things, like you could turn on the camera. It could, what else could it do? Just about anything. You could open up your CD drive on your machine if you've got one anymore. So anyway, it could do all kinds of crazy stuff. And it turns out that the Zeus developers, who are still out there and operational, decided they were going to make theirs more general purpose. So they're actually catching up with Citadel now. So there's almost like this arms race out there in the cybercrime. So as you can see, Citadel is becoming, it's one of those, it's a Swiss Army knife of malware tools. So it's kind of interesting. So when we look at how widely spread out a lot of this malware is, whether it's Citadel, whether it's Zeus, whether it's Dire, there's all kinds of different malware out there that we're tracking. What we see is that about 1 in 500 machines is infected with one of these Mad APTs that we're calling at any given point in time. And you can see, based upon this map, who the big targets are, right? So the one with the most infection rate at the moment is actually Saudi Arabia. And I don't know why that is off the top of my head. But you also see that Great Britain has a fair amount of infection rate, as does Belgium, and Chile's in there. So you can see through this heat map how infected everyone is. So it's kind of an interesting trend that we're seeing. We're not entirely sure what to infer from this, although we do know that Brazil is starting to spin up a cybercrime syndicate that's relying on malware. So that's sort of naturalized. We've seen a lot of the stuff from the Ukraine and Russia, Eastern Bloc countries, but we're starting to see that's taking root in South American countries as well. So just sort of an interesting thing to pay attention to. There's another piece of malware which is also kind of interesting in the way it deals with things, which is we call it Kale Remote. And so we call it a piece of malware that does virtual mugging. Sorry, I need to take a drink. So what that means is we know that there are some pretty effective countermeasures for some of this malware already. So for example, Citadel will actually throw, so if you're on your web browser on your machine and you go to a banking site, Citadel can take over that web page and inject HTML into it that will ask you for things like your social security number, which your bank probably would not ask you for. But it's useful if you want to go now and get your tax returns, for example. So it's basically doing a injection in the browser. So there's a lot of software now which is pretty good at identifying that kind of stuff. So what these malware authors realize is that if they can actually get a point of presence on your computer, what they can do is they can mimic you. They can actually pretend that they're you. So what they do is they'll actually get this malware installed through phishing or however they get it on there, and they'll wait till you go to a banking site, and then they'll take a screen capture of the logon page for that banking site, and then they'll put it up as a modal dialog box. It's in front of everything else. And then they'll throw a little message on top of it that says, please wait, there's been a problem with your account, getting someone from customer service online. Now, that's sitting up in front of your face, but actually what they do is they launch your browser on your machine behind that box so you can't see it happening. And then they will actually go into the bank and they will start to do things like transfer money. You have no idea that that's happening. They're just doing it from your machine. And so what that does is it bypasses some of the things like if you've ever gone to a banking site and says, hey, you've never been onto our bank from this particular machine on this particular browser, you need to answer your security question. Or we'll send you an out-of-band text message and you got to type in that passcode. This actually gets around that because they're using a browser that's been registered with your bank on a machine that's been registered with your bank. So they're basically bypassing the whole thing. So while you're staring at this static screen, which supposedly is going to get somebody to help you, somebody from support from the bank, they're actually robbing you blind behind the scenes. And you can notice in the screen cap as well that some of this stuff is actually so user-driven, so user-friendly that they actually say, just press this button to start phishing. Just press this button to block the page. So it's kind of interesting. It's kind of idiot-proof. The little bar on the left-hand side is the malware as it's displayed to the cyber criminal. It is not displayed to the end user who's on this machine. Right. So kind of interesting how they've operationalized this. So all that said, I've just told you all the bad things and how we're losing the battle and all that good stuff. So what can you do to protect yourself? So there's a few things. Number one is keep up with threat intelligence. One of the things that we do is we try to arm our customers with trends and let them know about malware, and so that they have some actions they can take. You should be blocking these IP addresses because we think that they're command and control servers for botnets, or they're phishing, or block these emails because we believe they're phishing, et cetera, et cetera. So threat intelligence is important to keep up with, both to update your technology, but also just so you're cognizant, so you can start making smart decisions. So if you see some sort of malware that's hit your machine, as I was talking about with that retailer who saw the same thing 6 months before they actually detected their attack, then you are now armed with that information to go, whoa, this looks like something that's targeting point of sale systems. And so that's going to inform me that this is more important for me to investigate rather than just tune out as white noise and go about my day. So threat intelligence is important. One of the things that people do not do, I find few organizations do this, which is keep a current and accurate asset inventory. And what we mean by that is not necessarily you've got to figure out which every mobile phone is and every laptop and all that, but at least start out with your critical assets, things that contain information that is sensitive, credit card data, employee information, intellectual property, source code, anything like that, right? Financial information, HR, all of that stuff. Find out where that stuff is, who owns it, what applications are on there, who should be using it, et cetera, et cetera. Because at least then you are protecting your crown jewels, your most important assets. But I find that most people sort of succumb to analysis paralysis. They think that they have to do everything and have to do it perfectly, but that's not actually the case. And I'll give you an example wwhere some of this actually caused problems. There was a healthcare provider that was compromised to their VPN gateway because the VPN gateway was vulnerable to Heartbleed, and they never patched it, even though there was a patch out by the vendor. There are many reasons. I don't know exactly what happened, but I suspect what ended up happening is they didn't have an accurate asset inventory, and a VPN gateway should be one of those things. It's a pretty critical asset that they should have identified and kept up with vendor patches, so threat intelligence, and known that it was available and that they had that particular technology, and it should have been patched. But they didn't because they probably failed either or both of these first two recommendations. And then, of course, we sort of talked about have a patching solution that covers your entire infrastructure, which is sort of important, right? Because, again, all these things feed into each other, at least these top three. So make sure that you have the ability to actually patch automatically instead of sending people all around, particularly if you're a global company. Implement mitigating controls. What we mean by that is there are technologies out there that are table stakes, firewalls, IPSs, endpoint protection. We could argue about the efficacy of antivirus, et cetera, et cetera. But, make sure that you've got the appropriate stuff out there and that they're helping you. And I'll talk about that here in a second, just a little bit more. But make sure that you're not just blocking things, but that you're also monitoring. So make sure you are capturing logs, capturing network data, and even if you're not doing correlation and proactively looking for things, which you should be, at least you'll have that data available to you if you need to go through a forensics exercise. So I'll tell you that I had a customer a few years ago, and they had an administrator that they fired. I don't know why, but he was apparently doing something they didn't like. He knew their processes really well for onboarding administrators, so he faked a personality and talked the administrators for the organization he had just been fired from into believing that he was a new administrator, and he went through all the processes, and they even sent him an RSA key fob so he could get into the VPN concentrator. 2 months later, he must have been drinking. It was about midnight, and he decided to go in and have a data rampage, and he tried to delete all kinds of data on their organization. So it turns out he was successful in some cases. He wasn't in others. Fortunately, they had some mitigating controls for some things. But we were able to work with the assistant district attorney's office in the locale and build a case against him based upon having net flows and events from all the machines that he went to the point where he was actually, he finally pleaded out. At first, he pleaded innocent to destroying data. He didn't say that he got into the systems, but he pleaded innocent to destroying the data. But eventually, the night before we went to court, he pleaded out and agreed that he had destroyed data. So he's now facing 4 to 6 years in jail as a result of that. So if nothing else, have the ability to go back and do the forensics. But the reality is you should also have good correlation rules. So be able to look for things that are suspicious at the same time. So, for example, insider threat, look for somebody who's doing more queries to your customer relationship database than normal. So look at the volume of polls that they're doing. So maybe they're trying to download your entire customer database. And then followed by, say, a large file transfer to some sort of cloud-based document storage like Box.com or Gmail or Google Docs or something like that. So those two things together can help you to identify when something bad is going to happen, even if your firewall doesn't stop it, for example. And then finally, create a broad incident response plan. What that means is don't wait until something happens before you know how you're going to respond. Again, you need to be able to do forensics, so make sure you're ready to do that. Make sure you've got a plan. Who's responsible for investigation? Who do you call in? Who's going to be your responders? Do you do it inside? Do you have a third party outside that's going to come help you? How does HR respond? How does finance respond? How does public relations respond? How does your legal team respond? Make sure that all that's documented and test it. Do tabletop exercises because you don't want to wait until you're actually in the middle of an incident that's going to be on the front page of the New York Times before you actually test your incident response plan and find out that nobody knows what to do or that you missed a particular step in it or whatever, right? And so part of that, by the way, is engaging whoever it is that's going to be doing the investigations and the impact analysis early on so that they have a lay of the land. They know what your environment looks like. Look, you never send the Marines in to an uncharted territory that's hostile, full of hostiles. You always have some intelligence because you want to be able to hit the ground running and take that mission down in quick haste, capture that hill and move on. So don't wait until the last minute. So one of the things that we talk about a lot is that there's this sort of defeatism that says it's not if, it's when. Well, I'll tell you, okay, that's true, but the if, that sort of implies that all ifs are the same or all whens are the same or whatever I'm trying to say. In other words, not all incidents are going to be the ones that land you on the pages of the New York Times. So your best effort is to protect as much as possible and be ready when you can stop these things. And to contain them when they are small incidents before they blossom out into a full-blown compromise of your entire assets, right? So we think of that in terms of smarter prevention, security intelligence, and then response. And so what we mean by that is have the prevention in place. Prevention does work, right? It doesn't work completely, it doesn't work for everything, but at least stop 80% of your attacks before they even get started. So things like Trusteer Apex Endpoint, which is an endpoint protection product that we have at IBM, it basically is behavior-based. It sits on the endpoint and looks for bad things happening. There's BigFix, which is endpoint configuration product that we have, which you can actually do. You can run fixlets on endpoints, so you can set registry settings to particular values. You can update software. There's all kinds of things you can do with BigFix. Mass 360 for mobile. That's the endpoint protection for mobile. So now you've got that all covered. And then of course there's intrusion prevention through what we have our IPS, which is called the XGS. We also have an ecosystem that allows all kinds of vendors to plug in on the prevention side. Then when it comes to intelligence, so you're protecting everything, but the things that get through the 20%, but even when something gets caught by the prevention, you want to be able to do forensics after the fact. Have the ability to capture all of this information. So QRadar has it's not just a SIM, but there's also risk manager. There's vulnerability manager, which is effectively a vulnerability assessment tool that feeds into QRadar. And then there's incident forensics, which gives you the ability to visualize the entire chain of events that led up to the attack. So in other words, you can actually recreate Word documents. You can listen in on voice over IP calls that happened in the past. as you're going through the forensics process. And then from a continuous response, again, QRadar incident forensics, okay, I gave away that one already. Big Fix will give you the same ability to be able to go pull data from the machines that were compromised. Fast 360 is going to give you that same ability as well. And then, of course, there's emergency response services. You know, you've got 1-800 24/7 partner to help you out with emergency response. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say that you have to use IBM X-Force threat intelligence and feed into all of this stuff. So I want to come back to one point before I end up here, though. You know, so I'm talking a lot about products here, but again, most important, get the people to do the implementation, do it properly, and be there when you need them. So think about this. Even when something's implemented, you still need to tune it continuously. Your organization, your environment is going to change. You add new employees, you remove them, you do acquisitions, you change your network, you add new technologies. Your IT infrastructure, by design, should be continuously changing. And so consequently, to set and forget is a bad security posture. So you need to have somebody who's there to help you, whether you do it inside, whether you hire the full-time employees to manage your security infrastructure, or whether you outsource it to somebody like Lighthouse Computer Services, right? So they're experts in this, at implementation, at continuously being part of your ecosystem and helping you to tune things, add new technologies, both to enable your organization and to protect it. So just wanted to say, make sure that you've got appropriate eyeballs on screens as well as technology in racks. And so with that, I will tell you that you can get more information from the following resources: our Twitter feed. You can download some reports from the X-Force, as well as I encourage you to go to securityintelligence.com, where there's a lot of blogging activity that's really interesting. And so I am done talking for now, and I'm happy to entertain any questions in the last 7 minutes of your time. So shoot. Tasha, are you seeing any questions? Or?
We are not. We don't have any questions at this time, ladies and gentlemen. Just a reminder, if you do have questions for Chris, you can go ahead and click on the message tab and type your question in the white box.
And so while we're waiting, and there may not be any questions, I will leave you with one of my particular views on this. So you saw all the incidents that happened, and one of the things that I'm passionate about is being fired. I want to be fired from every job that I ever fulfill. And the reason is that I think part of the reason why we see a lot of these incidents is that people are they're not executing bold moves in security. So I ran a company a while back, and one of my consultants, he was actually our chief consultant, he just took a job as a CIO of a financial institution, and so he called me up and he said, look, we have an old antivirus infrastructure here. What would you do if you were in my shoes to replace it? So I told him that I would not put antivirus in. I would throw antivirus out the window completely, and I would go with a behavior-based endpoint protection system, because we know that antivirus is about 10% effective, or at best, right? Even the CEO of Symantec said that antivirus is dead. So I said, that's what I said. So he says, well, I don't want to be the CIO that gets fired if we get compromised because I didn't put in antivirus. And I said, you should aspire to be fired for that. You know, frankly, doing the same thing over and over, as they say, everybody attributes this to Albert Einstein, but apparently that wasn't the case. Insanity is defined by doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And I think that's kind of where we are in the security industry. We're doing the same thing over and over, and yet we're still getting compromised and we're not winning. So what we need to do is put ourselves on the line. We need to make bold moves. Throw out antivirus, start putting in endpoint protection, hire more people, less products, figure out what's working, what's not. Go and figure out a good way to define metrics. Go talk to the business people instead of the technologists in security. So all of those things. And at the worst case, you know what's going to happen? You are going to get fired for being bold. And when you go to your next job interview, bearing in mind that we have negative unemployment in the security industry, so you will get hired within a couple of weeks if you want to. When you go to your next job interview, you go, hey, I got fired because I made bold moves. They go, we don't want anybody to make bold moves. You go, that's fine. That's not the job for me. I'll just go on to the next one. So that's what I'm telling you. Aspire to be fired. That is my message to leave you with.
Chris, we do have a question in the queue.
Sure, go.
Right, the question is, for user protection, how much does running Mac versus Windows PC help reduce risk? And how about Chromebook over both Mac and Windows PC for both that only uses browsers?
That's interesting. So it turns out that there's not as the malware for Mac is not quite as prolific as that for PCs. There's a couple of reasons for that. One of them historically has been market penetration. And the second one is that it was Windows being on an open platform meant that there was a lot more applications that had more vulnerabilities in them. So, which actually goes back to market penetration and user adoption. But now Mac is taking on a fair amount of market penetration. So we're starting to see more and more cross-platform malware. In fact, what it's often exploiting is Java. So the reality is that there's more malware that targets Windows, but I would say, in my opinion, the way that you need to view those two things is if they have equal target footprint, because you can write malware for Mac. So there's no question about it, and definitely Macs are being targeted. So that's number one. So number two, in terms of Chromebook, and actually the way that it deals with web browsers, et cetera, I have not played around a lot with that. I believe that the Chromebooks are transient between reboots. So the reality is you can still be compromised. It's still up to what the browser itself is configured as, because a lot of this drive-by malware actually targets the plugins in your browser, and so the browser can still be compromised. The question is whether or not the malware persists across reboots, right? Or whether you have to go back to that particular website to be compromised again. So the answer to that question is it does provide a little bit more measure of security, but again, it is not none of these things are impervious to attack. So I would not rely on running Chromebook as being the answer to the problem. Think about it in another way, right? Is that mobile itself kind of has the same profile as a Chromebook. In fact, it has the exact profile of a Chromebook. And we do see that there is a fair amount of Android malware out there. So again, it depends upon the apps that the people download, where they get it. So the Google Play Store is less likely to have infected apps, but you can get APKs from just about anywhere. Whereas, for example, with iPhones, you can only get apps from the Apple App Store. And so they do some validation on that. So I guess what I'm saying in the grand scheme of things is Chromebook is probably equivalent to an Android mobile device, and Apple Mac desktops and laptops and Windows should be considered to have the same threat profile. Any other questions in the last 1 minute?
There are no more questions in the queue.
Well, look at us ending up right on time. So thank you, everyone, from me, and thank you, Lighthouse, for providing this opportunity. I could talk for 2 or 3 hours on this topic, but I'm going to give everybody their afternoon back.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes today's event. Thank you so much for joining. You may now disconnect.